Hi everybody, and welcome to another ECOWind Policy Masterclass series webinar. Today we're going to be talking about cumulative effects. I'm just going to wait a minute or two because we've still got some people joining, and we'll start at 2 or 3 minutes past. For those of you that just joined, we're just going to wait a minute or two for people to arrive, and then we will kick off at 2 or 3 minutes past. Okay, in the interest of time, I think we'll start. Thank you all for coming today. I appreciate it's half term at the moment for many of you, so thank you for turning up. Today, we're going to be talking about cumulative impacts assessment. As always, this is going to be recorded and put on the ECOWind website, so please do let your colleagues know so that they can come along and watch it afterwards. Today we've got we're talking about cumulative impact assessment. I would just say that on the 11th of June we're talking about marine monitoring, and then marine net gain, marine spatial planning, 5 capitals, fisheries policy management, and then the English seabird conservation and recovery pathway at the end. We have previously talked about strategic compensation and the overall policy landscape, and those webinars are up, I believe, on the ECOWind website. So if you go there, you can have a look at them. Today, we've got Ed Wilsteed, who is Associate Director here at HMC. Many of you know Ed as a fisheries specialist, but he did his PhD on cumulative effects assessment and has been considering actually how you use cumulative effects in decision making for many years. So we're lucky to have Ed talking to us today. Ed's going to present to us on cumulative effects assessment, and then we're going to have a panel discussion as usual for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we will take comments or questions and from attendees as well. As we go through, if you've got questions that you want to answer, then please do put them in the Q&A and we'll pick them up at the end. Brilliant. Ed, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Dickon. So start with what are cumulative effects and what is cumulative effects assessment. So just to note that there are many definitions, which is actually one of the challenges for those tasked with delivering good cumulative effects assessment. So we'll just start out here with a simple definition. So cumulative effects are the range of effects that collectively influence the condition or health of species, of populations, of the environment. And cumulative effects assessment is the process of then evaluating those cumulative effects. And it's the process that should inform the management of those cumulative effects. And what I'm going to run through today is firstly just something which hopefully will convince everyone that cumulative effects assessments are the most important of all environmental assessments, and to set out why we need to do better, what the state of the art is, and to highlight recommendations and research needs that will bring good science, policy, and delivery closer together. So to begin with, I'll just spend a moment outlining where cumulative effects came from, because it sets the scene for why we're still working out what good CEA is, and also highlights why ECOWind and the other research initiatives that are designed to inform policy are so important, and why the efforts of the scientific community are crucial to progress. So the origin of CEA is closely tied to the emergence and then formalization of environmental impact assessment. And Rachel Carson, who in the 1960s published Silent Spring, gave voice to the growing concern that the rapid industrial and agricultural progress in the 20th century was incrementally degrading our environment. And the title of the book alludes to that loss of songbirds caused by the widespread use of pesticides at the time. And the book was instrumental because it gathered popular and political opinion around the need to limit or at least understand the impact of development on the environment. And it led in 1969 in the USA to the enactment of the National Environment Policy Act. And that was the act which brought environmental impact assessment into being. And fast forward to the 21st century, in EIA, environmental impact assessment is required in more than 180 countries around the globe. But it was soon realized that we needed to broaden our horizons to include larger spatial scales and longer time periods to deal with the incremental degradation at ecologically meaningful scales. And that's what led to the birth of cumulative effects assessment. And that's led to a huge proliferation of legal requirements to assess cumulative effects, either explicitly or implicitly. And it's important to stress here that there has long been a legal obligation for good CEA at international and national levels, yet, as I'll show and discuss in a bit, we're still struggling to get robust and trusted CEAs into decision making. And the range of instruments listed here on this slide highlighted a few of the challenges from a policy perspective. So there's a wide range of drivers. They've got different focal points. They've got slightly different sort of expected outcomes, from individual species to sites to ecosystem health. And there's also a diversity of language, and practitioners will often tell you that the definitions found in the legal instruments are ambiguous and lead to different interpretations of what good CEA entails. But that proliferation reflects what we know about human activities and how those human activities collectively influence the environment. And what really matters is the sustainability of the things that we care about, the valued components in the environment. And valued components, or VCs, they never experience one causal agent acting on their condition, on their sustainability. Their condition is determined by a range of effects that they experience. So environmental assessment of any kind should always search for cumulative effects, and that is to say, what are the multiple stresses and forces acting on VCs, and how do they cumulatively affect those valued components? And CEAs should tell us about how fragile or resilient valued components are to further disturbance, and so are a crucial building block of sustainable development. So if we're interested in the health of a population, of a valued component, what does this mean relative to cumulative effects assessment? So CEAs should always start with the valued component, the thing that we're seeking to protect, to conserve. What is the status of that valued component? How healthy is it? What is the trend in the population? What matters to that particular species in terms of its habitat, food, reproduction, health? And then the challenging part for CEA is then moving into the analysis phase to discern the suite of factors that impact the health of the population and determining how those factors interact to influence the status and condition. So, for example, if we want to understand what impact an offshore wind farm is going to have on a valued component, we need to be aware of what else is going on. And this is important because the main way that decision makers have been informed about the impact of a development is traditionally through environmental impact assessment, which, relative to understanding cumulative effects, don't work particularly well. And the same is also true when we want to understand how human activities are affecting the status of the wider environment, an ecosystem. As mentioned before, there are various drivers for CEAs, from protecting species to habitats to achieving good environmental status. And relative to our legal requirement, and again stressing that this is a legal requirement to implement ecosystem approaches, again, cumulative effects are the only effects that matter. So the status of the environment depends on the full spectrum of activities, of drivers and of stressors that influence how healthy the environment is and what impact additional development would have. So relative to CEA, the same basic principles apply. Understand the health status and trend, and understand the suite of factors at play, and determine how those factors cumulatively affect the health and status of the environment. And to flag that cumulative effects are ubiquitous, this is a map of the footprint of human activities, at least those that we've got data sets for, across the globe. So Ben Halpin and colleagues, who were instrumental in 2008 to bringing greater attention to cumulative effects in the marine environment and have subsequently repeated that approach and methodology a number of times to show change over time. Layered spatial data sets of human activities over spatial data sets of sensitive habitats to flag global hotspots. And you can see that UK waters are among those with the highest cumulative impact score as defined by the methodology presented in that paper. Now, there are important assumptions that need to be understood, but the point is here, cumulative effects are the norm. And the need for good CEA is increasing. Development is not slowing down, And CEA is essential to support resolution of the three policy trilemma as we seek to protect and restore biodiversity, to address climate change, and to move towards secure, low-carbon energy generation. And relative to the key source of information about cumulative effects in marine management and decision-making, how are we doing? And in a nutshell, not well. And this is due to the reliance on EIA without a supporting framework to provide the necessary context at ecologically meaningful scales. And the areas where EIA are particularly poor are time, the adequate consideration of the status and condition of valued components, and at assessing cumulative effects overall. And meanwhile, the legal requirements for CEA have expanded into strategic assessments, into an ecosystem assessments, approaches, good environmental status, and so on, and bringing the necessary broader perspective into decision-making. However, EIA remains the dominant source of information during consenting about cumulative effects. Now, to be clear, we should not stop EIAs. The polluter pays principle is key, and EIAs provide high-resolution data. But to make the most of that data, I'd argue that we need to reconceive EIAs to primarily assess cumulative effects, and that EIAs should inform a strategic CEA, which is managed by government. So given what we know about the shortcomings of EIAs relative to assessing cumulative effects, and knowing that cumulative effects are the only effects that matter, there's a very strong argument that planners and regulators need more capacity, more teeth, and should be the arbiters of what is significant. And that requires them to have access to trusted and robust CEAs that speak to ecologically meaningful scales. So briefly, just to touch on some of the challenges that remain, and one of the reasons why CEA remains a difficult ask. What are those challenges that need to be addressed to deliver good CEA into decision making? And what are some of those challenges facing scientists and decision makers? And on the science side, there's no getting away from the fact that we're trying to understand change within complex adaptive systems. We've got shifting baselines, and generally and often we've got limited information about thresholds. On the delivery side, there's a diversity of drivers, there's a diversity of requirements for cumulative effects assessments. There are multiple definitions out there, and there are unclear expectations to guide practice. And sort of bridging those two, we know that we're always going to have knowledge gaps. There are also capacity challenges. And there's a critical part here around the communication and the understanding to bring the science into policy. So what am I going to touch on for the next couple of minutes is just what we found out from some recent investigations into the state of the art. So this was research that was responding to the need to adopt a standardized approach to conducting CEA to support marine plan development and decision making. So HMC were commissioned to assess the suitability of existing approaches to CEA and to provide next step recommendations to bring good CEA into marine planning. So building on a peer-reviewed study that was published in 2023, we looked at those published CEAs, we broadened that pool of approaches to include known regional approaches such as those applied by OSPAR, by ICES and so on. And we eventually ended up with more than 120 CEAs to look at. And the key point is that, broadly speaking, we can classify those into four broad categories, which I'll spend a couple of minutes just introducing here. And the other useful part of this study was that we also interviewed those needing CEAs, including marine planners, those conducting and delivering CEAs, including with ICES, Canadian government and German government. And ended up looking at 15 of the approaches in more detail to determine suitability relative to the needs of marine planners. And the reason for highlighting this is just to show that firstly, there's a range of approaches out there, but it'll also sort of feed into some of those observations that will come shortly. So the first broad category is what we've termed cumulative impact mapping. And these are approaches which were derived from that original approach by Halpern in 2008. And these are effectively a mapping approach that overlays spatial data sets of species, of habitats and activities. Now, one of the really important assumptions underlying this is that an activity equates to a pressure and therefore to an impact. And validation studies, the few that have been done, have highlighted it's really important that we validate modeled outcomes. Because there have been, for example, examples in Australia where they've looked at sort of coral reefs and they had this cumulative impact mapping approach and then sent divers out. There was a significant discrepancy between predicted impacts and what was actually observed in the environment. Now, there are some real strengths to this approach, not least that if you do have the data, you can apply the same approach at multiple scales. And because this approach has been around for a while, it's evolved over time, and there are advanced examples that integrate empirical data and that are particularly robust. The other point to highlight here is that the outputs are among the easiest to understand. Many people just understand maps. It's something visual, it's something that we get. And sometimes you may just need to know where to look, where to focus attention. The second category are DAPSA approaches. Now, DAPSA, driver, activity, pressure state, impact response frameworks have been used widely as a conceptual framework to understand causal relationships between society and the environment. Now, DAPSA goes a step beyond impact mapping by putting greater focus on the relationship between a pressure and valued components of the environment. And the other point to flag here is that DAPSA was also explicitly designed to support implementation of the ecosystem approach. So it doesn't have those limitations which are linked to the narrower perspectives applied by EIA type approaches. And there are established examples from regional organizations like OSPAR that provide a means of identifying relative importance of different pressures on the state of the environment, so that greater understanding of the causal relationships which we get from applying sort of DAPSA approaches help prioritize management interventions to focus on those with the greatest impact or risk of impact. The third broad category are specialist approaches. Now, these are bespoke approaches that respond to specific questions and specific species or populations or habitats. These are high-resolution modeling approaches, and there's a wide range of examples. Perhaps the best known are those which are applied to seabirds, particularly in relation to offshore wind, and cetaceans in relation to noise. The depth of understanding required about the species and about how those species respond to specific pressures is pretty deep. So these tend to be data-rich CEAs, and they're also among the most technical, and in some cases the hardest for non-technical people to understand. But the approaches are typically robust. But because those are highly targeted, it's hard to envision such an approach being applied across all situations. The fourth approach, and this is a broader category, and it's not strictly a category in itself, but this is the integration of risk-based approaches to CEA. Now, we know that there are always going to be data gaps, knowledge gaps, and what risk-based approaches provide us is a path forward where there are those gaps and uncertainties. It's a means of making explicit what those uncertainties are and what the effect of those uncertainties are relative to the risk of something having an impact on whatever we care about. The other positive about the risk-based approaches is it provides a language which is commonly understood, particularly in industrial sectors, and supports communication across sectors. And there are CEA methodologies out there which include a risk assessment component. The example shown there is from Stelzenmuller, which is one of the more recent applications. And it sets out a formalized way of bringing risk into cumulative effects assessment. But the challenge, particularly for decision makers, is the current variation, that variability in how risk assessment is currently included within CEAs that do. So turning to some of the observations that we found from this review of the approaches which are out there, different approaches have different strengths and weaknesses, and that diversity is really important because the range of things that we need to understand in terms of how cumulative effects act on species or habitats or ecosystem, it's unlikely that we're ever going to find one approach which would answer those questions. And there's strength in that diversity if we can harness it. The other observation is that perhaps obviously data are absolutely key, and it's key both to the resolution and to the robustness of the outputs which are there. And as mentioned before, we know that we're going to have data gaps, knowledge gaps, because we're operating within complex adaptive systems. But as we've seen, risk-based approaches actually allow us to make progress in a transparent and robust way. One of the other observations was that a shared baseline would promote consistency across approaches, particularly if we're looking at sort of repeating approaches to generate some understanding of how things have changed over time. So if we've got a sort of a consistent baseline underlying that, that would support the use of those CEAs. And that leads to one of the other observations, that there's still very few CEAs out there which include time, that include the temporal data sets. And there are good reasons for that, again, because often we don't have those time series, or where we do have those time series, it's often very difficult to integrate those into CEA methodologies. And the final observation to flag is that many CEAs are complex. This is a technical task, and it's difficult for non-scientists often to understand what's being shown. And maps, as just highlighted here, are among the easiest approaches to understand, but because of those sort of underlying assumptions there, they're not necessarily the most robust approaches. So now looking towards how we can actually make some progress, what are we suggesting? One of the critical points, and this is from discussions with those marine planners, highlighted that some questions may not need cumulative effects assessments. CEAs are resource intensive, and it's important to decide if a CEA is necessary, or will something like a map of hotspots do. So we need to define when CEA is needed and why. And the question is also sort of critical. It's the thing that actually shapes the CEA. What's the right question to ask? And what is the supporting information that enables us to decide on a particular approach? So recognizing that we're likely to always require a range of approaches, we need to enable consistency, coherence, transparency, and adaptability. The adaptability particularly refers to advancing technologies, and as we make use of things such as artificial intelligence, perhaps, then we need to make sure that whatever sort of overarching framework we can move towards, that it's adaptable to make use of technological advances. And that framework is critical. We need to have that framework to agree sort of guiding principles, effectively to set out the conditions for consistency, and to within that framework to permit a toolbox approach that allows us to use different approaches best suited to specific questions. What we do need to do, particularly relative to decision making, is to define the expectations and to establish some minimum standards. And the final point here to make progress is the investment. We need to invest in CEA across planning and delivery needs at regional scales, and that refers to both the science, but also the understanding of CEAs and the capacity of people within government to make best use of CEAs. So what might progress look like? So we suggest that it requires two perspectives of CEA. CEA is an ongoing process, and CEAs that are targeted at specific questions. The process sets the framework for those targeted CEAs, promoting the consistency, that coherence, and the transparency, including the consistent use of open source data. And the targeted CEAs provide the resolution and detail needed to understand specific questions, such as what the cumulative effects of an offshore wind farm will be on valued ecological components. And what is key to progress is that these targeted CEAs can be brought into strategic decision making, that the CEAs can inform and improve the strategic CEA over time. And that requires that blend of consistency, coherence, and transparency. And those are sort of the overarching sort of principles that we're really promoting. And recognizing that no one CEA is going to provide all the answers, we need that strategic CEA overseen by government that determines the significance of impacts identified by targeted CEAs. And those provide trusted information at ecologically meaningful scales about what management we need to deal with cumulative effects. So the last slide is just a suggested research agenda and some of the points which have been coming out from our research. And I'll just highlight 4 points here. So one of the key ones, and as Dickon mentioned, a lot of my work, a lot of the research, we've been looking at how to bring sort of CEA into decision making. And one of the big disconnects that we can see between many CEAs which are out there is how to bring that into a sort of a quality, a robustness, which is of use to decision makers. So we need to understand the impact pathways for science to affect the delivery landscape and to enable that strategic CEA. There's another question there about what is good enough CEA? What do we really need to know? What data gaps matter? Which are the key ones that we actually need to focus sort of monitoring and validation on? And one of the key points that also comes out of much of the studies into cumulative effects assessment is that shortfall in knowledge around the significance of effects, the thresholds, and also thinking through some of the social implications as well as ecological implications, bringing diverse values into determining significance and thinking through some of the trade-offs. And then the final point that I'll just flag here is how can we actually bring some of this science forward for capacity constrained nations? How can we fast track the CEA knowledge that we're accruing in places like the UK, which is making strides here, and enable that for use in other environments where development is apace, but they're capacity constrained? Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ed. That was really good. You covered a lot of ground in a short period of time, so thank you very much. We're going to have a short panel discussion now while people are putting questions in the chat. So if Kim and Sam, yeah, if you could, great to get your cameras on. That's really good. So we've got some pre-prepared questions that we're going to talk through. I'm going to start with you, Ed. There's an interesting question about the fact that we have been talking about cumulative effects assessment in one form or another for the last 20 or 30 years since the legal requirement came in. And during that time, projects are being consented, plans are being approved. And so Kim, I'll come to you after this to talk about how easy it is to do cumulative effects assessment in EIA, because you've got experience of that. Ed, I'd be interested to know whether you think that the way that we're currently doing cumulative effects assessment, well, it's obviously being determined to meet the legal thresholds because things are being consented, but whether as a practitioner you think that they are meaningful or not.
No.
I shouldn't have given you a closed question, should I?
The reason for saying that, I've also sort of like sat down. The reason for undertaking my PhD is just because I got so annoyed at how sort of cumulative effects assessments were done within EIAs, and just looking at the capacity of people within planning inquiries to actually understand the information that was coming out. I think they could be really useful. I think there's really important information, as I mentioned. EIAs are important. They provide high resolution information and all the rest of it. The part for me that's missing is that strategic, the sort of like the broader picture into which the EIAs could fit. The reason for flagging where sort of CEA came from, it came from sort of EIAs. So we've always sort of like been developing that sort of model rather than thinking about the parallel development relative to the planning and consenting system, the parallel development of that broader perspective, which I think is essential to sort of cite EIAs within.
Yeah, okay, great. And Kim, from your perspective, having sat within the EIA process producing environmental statements, what's your experience of trying to do cumulative effects assessment?
So to be perfectly honest, I know myself I've written some really bad cumulative effects assessments. But it's really hard, and it goes back to what Ed was saying on we need to focus on what data gaps matter and what do we really need to know. But the big challenge is just having the availability of data. So often when we're writing the cumulative effects assessments, we're relying on other projects, so other existing cumulative effects assessments, and they might use different data collection techniques and different assessments, or just have incomplete or outdated data. So I think, yeah, we need to improve on how we're sharing that data across both industry and government, and that's including post-consent data as well would be really helpful. But it's really tricky to then make sure that all applications are fair, and there's that balance of putting sort of an unfair burden on each offshore wind project.
Yes. So Sam, I'm going to come back to you in a minute to ask a question about who should be doing cumulative effects assessment and those kind of, but Kate has put a question in the chat that's actually related to what Kim's just said, so I'm going to take that now. So that question about how do you define a shared baseline for assessing cumulative effects against, and who is in and who is out of any cumulative effects assessment is an important one. And just to say, as a regulator, you define who is in and who is out as someone that has a live application that's in the public domain. and if they've gone before you, then you do a cumulative effects assessment again that includes them. There is a question about baseline and what baseline you should be assessing cumulative effects against. That's a really interesting one, and one that was spoken about quite a lot at the Structures in the Marine Environment Conference last week, because we have a massively changing baseline with climate change changing our ocean really, really quickly. Ed, I don't know if I'm going to come to this, quite a difficult question to answer. And I guess there are practicalities about how you define a baseline, aren't there, as well as sort of like ideal versions of that.
Yes, and I think it's always going to be an adaptive approach, but at some point we just need to sort of plant a flag. And I know that's sort of easier said than done, but I think there are some important initiatives out there. ICES is undergoing one at the moment with Gurjan Piet in Wageningen University, where they're sort of pressing ahead with a more comprehensive DAPSA approach that would, with sort of open source data, that would be a useful sort of approach to pick up on OSPAR, I think, because we've had those OSPAR reporting requirements for some time. Is also sort of like an important way of having some consistency of information and data that can help sort of establish those baselines. And I think like the Seabird sort of CEAs also seem to me to be like a really important example of where, because there's been that sort of concentrated focus for a while, it would be really interesting actually to hear from that community if they think that we're in a position where you could establish a strategic baseline for certain receptors. The part that I'm sort of also really interested in is that sort of strategic context, so that we can bring that coherence across different receptors and different sort of baselines into something which helps us get towards good environmental status, or whatever we determine the sort of like the ultimate endpoint is.
There's also a really important point about being distinct between baselines and targets. So there is a baseline of where we are now, where many of the targets that we have set are not being met. And so you can assess something against a baseline now and assess effect against that. And you can assess something against the target that you're going towards, and you will get a different level of assessment. So there's the argument about baselines, and you'll often hear people argue about a baseline that should be set in the 80s or in the 1800s, where actually that's less about a baseline and more about a target of where you want to move to, rather than where you've come from potentially. And if I would recommend, actually, when we're hoping to get, Colin Moffat gave a very good talk on shifting baselines and what that means for biodiversity restoration last week in Edinburgh, that we're hoping to get on the Insight website soon. So that's a note on that.
Just a quick addition to that as well. I think it also sort of flags some of the work by Jim Harris, which comes from a terrestrial environment, but Professor Harris has done quite a lot of writing on novel ecosystems and the things that are changing, and just flagging the caution about sort of, are we ever going to be able to get back to certain points given all the changes which are going on, climate change and invasive species or whatever it might be. So yeah, I think it remains an open question for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, we can come back to that, Ed. I've got a question that I'm going to ask Sam, actually. So Ed and Sam did the review for JNCC, and Beth Scott has asked, Ed, you stated that strategic CEA should be the responsibility of governments, and did you come across any best practice examples, and from which level of government in your review? And I guess feeding into that, Sam, any reflections you have on where cumulative effect assessment should be done and at those different levels would be great.
Do you want me to take that first?
Yeah, if you could. Yeah.
Sure. So I think it's a tricky one, because I think it comes down to like the purpose of doing the CEA. So if you're looking at a specific development, and you can integrate CEA into like an EIA, for example, and that planning process. But if you're looking at more wider strategic planning of an area, there's certainly more interest there in the kind of government agencies and government taking a role in doing the CEA. I think the challenge we found with the work we were doing for JNCC is that there's a lot of variation in understanding of CEAs in terms of the technical understanding of CEAs, and there's such a variety of methods out there, some of them which are really complex and sophisticated, that handing that over to a government agency to manage could be quite a tall ask. So, there's that bridging that gap between academia and to support government agencies in performing and carrying out CEAs. In terms of best practice, we spoke to Catherine Murray from Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada, and over there they have a dedicated team to carrying out CEAs. So they're approached with a question and they're tasked with answering that question, and they have a network of academic experts that they can reach out to support that assessment. And I guess it's worth flagging here that can take a year or 2 years to actually do. It's not a quick process. So that needs to be brought into consideration. But having that dedicated capacity to answer these questions and apply CEAs benefits, there are a lot of benefits from that approach, and that you maintain and develop a skill set within a team, within a government agency, that improves over time. But also that data set, that database improves over time, because they're using the same database and adding to that same database with every CEA that they do. So that seems like a good model. It's just investing in that capacity building, not just across the planning departments, but actually developing a specific team that focuses on CEA. And Ed, I don't need to add to that.
Yeah, I was going to say, Ed, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to flag as well. I think the example in Germany, when they started rolling out offshore wind, and the German government was involved in the initial sort of understanding of what those impacts were, and using that information to then feed down and shape subsequent EIAs, is a good example of that sort of government involvement being instrumental in sort of shaping how a particular sector rolls out. I think, as Sam mentioned with DFO, in Canada, when we spoke with Catherine, I mean, she was still very open about the fact that they're sort of still feeling their way through this, even though they've got that capacity. But you can see that by effectively setting up and starting to develop that capacity within one body, that you're starting to see, you can see a route through, I think, to getting to the point where you could have a functional strategic CEA. I think some of the other examples come from sort of watershed management as well, rather than marine examples, where they've got sort of like an overarching regional plan, and that's something which is instrumental in sort of determining the significance of impacts associated with individual developments.
Thanks, Ed. And I think that if you look at it from the highest to most strategic level, which is the UK Marine Strategy, that in itself should have a cumulative effect assessment associated with it that can then feed down into sectoral planning and marine planning and provide the context for project level cumulative effect assessment. So actually at project level, you're not having to do too much, to be honest. I mean, that's the ideal world, isn't it? I think there's a question that I think is important, particularly given our audience today. One of the interesting things I find whenever we discuss with researchers and we look at, we talk to various levels of government about what they're doing, and I think, Ed, you mentioned this, that the temporal aspect, the change aspect is often not included. The dynamic aspect of cumulative effect assessment is often not included. And actually, a lot of our research on the call today, that's what they're working on. They're working on the dynamic nature of ecosystems and trying to bring that ecosystem modelling aspect in, and the dynamic interaction between trophic levels. There's a balance between doing cumulative effect assessment that is simple enough to be able to get something meaningful that you can use it quickly, and having something that tells you the absolute truth about what's going to be happening in the next 10 years. And I'd be interested, Ed, to know about where that balance sits, and to what extent do we need those specialist technical approaches to be able to do something that's meaningful or not. And given the massive amount of change that's happening, not just climate change, but the extent of infrastructure that's coming out and going into the North Sea, for example.
Yeah, I think proportionality is such a key point. Where do you need to sort of invest those resources to have that more dynamic understanding of what's going on, versus something where you don't? And that's why we sort of like flagged the importance of the question. So, for example, there are good examples from Sweden of where they've got relatively sort of simple approaches that inform strategic environmental assessment and sort of set out different scenarios. And in that case, you've got sort of like scenario A, B, C, and it provides you with, depending on your development scenario, slightly different outcomes relative to, for example, your network of marine protected areas. So it helps you with a sort of like a relatively rough, but sort of like enough of an idea that you can start understanding where you might need to sort of focus down. So it might also be that you sort of like need a slightly nested approach, that where you've identified real sort of risk and concern, that, you know, that's where you start sort of investing greater resource, greater resolution of understanding, and bringing in those temporal aspects.
Yeah.
Can I just quickly
go on, Ed. Go on, Sam.
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about what you're going to be using the data for, the end result for. If you're using it as a communication tool, then that, you know, you can apply simpler methods. If you're using it to make decisions on trade-offs in marine planning, then it has to be really robust and be challengeable. So you have to be careful in that sense, which methods you're using. But I think thinking of it from like a marine planner perspective, who's going out to stakeholders to present the information, to run workshops and get stakeholder views on those findings. If it's something really complex, where it's essentially like a black box where you put information in and this is what it came out, it's going to be hard to get stakeholders to buy into that process and understand those results. So it has to be quite straightforward and transparent, and the people have to be able to communicate not just the findings, but the method of getting those findings as well. So yeah, there's a really important consideration there in terms of what you're actually using the results for.
Yeah, I'll just quickly flag for me. I mean, one of the things that we came up with in the report was a revised definition of what cumulative effects assessment is, and one of the key sort of additions is building on Adrian Judd's work and others before Adrian as well, to provide sort of more consistency of the understanding of what cumulative effects assessment should do. But the one bolt on that we kind of stuck on there was exactly as Sam says, what's it for? So adding on that bit there, that CEA ... to inform planning and management, so that it's got a sort of like a very targeted sort of outcome associated with it.
Great, thank you both. We've got two questions which I'm going to go to now. Ed, you mentioned defining thresholds as a knowledge gap. How would you recommend defining those thresholds? I mean, there's a circular thing there. It's a knowledge gap, so it needs to be sorted out.
Yes. Yeah, that's a fascinating question for a number of reasons. I think there's of course kind of like an ecological or sort of species centric response to that, and sort of understanding where you're going to hit particular tipping points, or, you know, go beyond the point of recovery or whatever it might be, and those can be set relative to sort of existing conservation goals, limits, whatever they might be. But there's another part to that which I'll just briefly touch on, I think, which is that there's also a political element to this. There's that sort of like social element of how we sort of value these things, and I think that's one of the sort of like the real areas for CEA moving forward, is also trying to bring in some of that social value. Like, how do we actually value some of these things? So what do we define acceptable thresholds as? And I don't have the answer. I think it's a fascinating area for research. I think for the people who are researching that, then it would be brilliant to sort of broaden horizons, to think through different sort of ways of looking at those values.
And a question for you, Kim. I'm right in thinking that when we're doing EIA, that threshold of significance is something that's determined through the process rather than something that's sort of set beforehand. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think so, not just like the technical approaches. Doing EIA, you've really got to think about the timing of your applications as well, because a lot of the time you're doing these assessments when you don't have a final design, and then you can end up overestimating impacts. So there needs to be a standardized way of being more accurate, but at the same time allowing the flexibility of the design and for the project to kind of change throughout as they like finalize the design.
And without so that what's known as the Rochdale envelope approach and for those people that don't do EIA, it's nothing to do with Rochdale. It's I think it was where they first used it, where they basically were assessing on a worst case scenario. When you're coming to do a cumulative effects assessment, you're taking their environmental statement, aren't you, that they've produced, which has that worst case scenario in it and might not be real. And so that becomes an issue as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. Dickon, if I could just add one thing, I think one of the things, like back doing some of those EIAs, what I was tasked with at the time was looking at the impact on fishing, well, commercial fish species and also commercial fisheries, and by extension, sort of like some coastal communities where they've got sort of like an importance of a fishery into that sort of like local economy. And one of the parts there was like, if you don't have any thresholds, if you don't have any limits, and you don't take into account that sort of degradation that's happened over time as you've sort of been losing things, then it is a really important part, because at what point do you say that actually, yes, that impact is quite significant? So we could say that, okay, by closing off that area of space or whatever it is, we're likely to lose 2 out of 10 fishing businesses in that particular area. Is that significant or not? Well, who do you ask? And sort of like, what's the threshold? And at what point do we sort of decide, okay, no, that's not acceptable, therefore we need to come up with some other solution?
Yes, those more qualitative values are much more difficult to determine, aren't they?
Yeah.
So it brings us on to a great question from Ros Green. Do you think the human demand for renewable energy will ever come second to the outputs of cumulative effects assessment? I.e., if a strategic level CEA showed we couldn't build any more offshore wind farms without unacceptable ecosystem level impacts, would it instantly stop development if there was still a desperate need for more generation capacity to meet energy demand? It's a great question.
Yes.
And one which takes the interplay of policy and regulation and planning all together. So the planning system is built so that you shouldn't be able to make that choice without having a conscious decision to do so. And what I mean by that is that if you've got effective cumulative effects assessment, both at an SEA level, and all plans need to have strategic environmental assessment, and at a marine plan level, and then at a sector plan level, you shouldn't be able to have a situation where you have unacceptable ecosystem level impacts and that plan going forward. The reality is that you get to a situation, as is we're looking at with offshore wind leasing, where actually the cumulative effect assessment becomes really important under the habitats regulation, where you're looking at plan level effects. And in those situations, you have to show public interest and you have to deliver compensation. And if you can't deliver that compensation, theoretically, you shouldn't be able to go ahead, or theoretically, you can't go ahead. And that does still hold true. I think, and Ed, I'd be interested in your view on this. The challenge at the moment is that we might not have good enough strategic level cumulative effects assessment to know one way or the other what those ecosystem level effects are going to be, that can help to inform policy. So we are operating slightly, not completely in the dark, but maybe in the twilight. And because of that, we're having to make judgments that where the managing of risk becomes really, really important.
Yeah.
Ed, I don't know if you've got any kind of comment, further comment on that.
Exactly that, Dick. And I think one of the other points is sort of like the understanding as well of what else is happening relative to the environment. So thinking about the OSPAR sort of cumulative effect assessment, if you go and have a look at their the name escapes me at the moment, but they've got these Sankey diagrams basically where you can go and look at particular receptors or parts of the environment, and it provides you with a breakdown of how different activities contribute to the condition of whatever you're looking at that point in time. So it's also an understanding that, yes, okay, so if we decide that the priority is offshore wind development, does that mean that something else needs to reduce so that we don't, another sector needs to reduce so that we don't have sort of like the overall pushing particular sort of good environmental status or whatever beyond some particular threshold. So there is that broader perspective, and exactly as you said, that requires that kind of strategic CEA process, and that again is another reason I think for flagging that this needs to be seen as a process. It's not something that we're going to have now, or it's not something that we're going to have in 5 years' time. It's an ongoing thing where I think you basically want to use targeted CEAs and all the rest of it to basically bring that cone of uncertainty down, so you've got greater certainty of how particular management interventions are reducing impacts in other areas, so that we can lift the ceiling on some developments or not. Yeah, it's about bringing things together into a coherent whole, but seeing that as a process that needs to be looked after over time.
So, and I'm sorry, Sam came. I'm going to go back to Ed with a follow-on question from Kate. So, building on that, Ed, potentially a lot of cumulative effects from offshore wind won't be fully understood or quantified until considerably after consent and operation, because it's such novel technology, and it is novel technology, even though it's a mature industry. Understanding the long-term effects of that laid on top of climate change, that's what programs like ECOWind were set up to do, but they are research programs that are pushing the boundaries of science rather than taking established science and using it in decision making, which is something that's different. Do you think our current, so Kate's put, do you think current policy, but rather than current policy, I'm going to say, do you think the current system adequately addresses this? Because you've got policy that says this is our direction of travel, and then you've got operation or delivery, which is taking that and trying to operationalize it in the real world, and that's changing really fast, and the Crown Estate and others are running as fast as they can to try and catch up with that. Do you think things like adaptive management, the way that we're trying to build either compensation or mitigation into things is good enough, I guess? And there's a difference between good enough and what is possible for us to do at the moment, I think. It's a hard question, sorry.
I don't know, I think, is the simple answer. And the reason for saying that is because, I mean, clearly not in some senses. I mean, it's something where the sort of like the risk appetite at different parts within that system are quite different. So relative sort of like the energy generation sort of risk appetite is quite different to the environmental sort of protection sort of risk appetite. And I think there's a fascinating piece there, which would actually be sort of like mapping out that system and thinking through those relationships and what those risk appetites are. And the reason for saying I don't know is also because just having listened to a podcast at the weekend, which was talking about the financing environment for offshore wind and just explaining some of the financial requirements, the feed-in tariff, how all of those things contribute to whether or not people make decisions to invest in offshore wind, and that is something where uncertainty is not well looked upon, but the inevitability of the natural environment is that we've got lots of uncertainty there. So yeah, I don't know is the simple answer, but I think it's going to have to take into account and probably be more explicit about how to be adaptive going forward.
Yeah. Okay. Last question, and then I'm going to ask you all for reflections before we close for today. It's about indirect effects. A question for any of you. Do we have? Is that something we looked into in the review, or are we just looking at? Is the state of the art at the moment actually just looking at direct effects because we don't know enough about ecosystem interactions, I guess is the question. Or the way I've reframed that, like how much is it taken into account in the practical delivery of CEA?
I'll pitch in just very briefly. I think some of those very specialist approaches, they do take into account indirect effects. So the PCOD, for example, it also depends how you define sort of indirect and direct effects. I mean, if you take a receptor-centric kind of approach, then you're trying to get an understanding of all the effects, all the things which are influencing the status, the condition of that particular receptor. So you would be taking into account prey availability, I don't know, hatching success, all of that sort of stuff. Whereas if you look at it from a sort of a development specific perspective, then some methodologies out there, and again, it's one of the shortcomings of the EIA, is that it doesn't take into account those what would then be termed indirect effects. So it depends. And I think one of the things that lots of people have been advocating for a long time is taking a receptor-centric kind of approach. So trying to understand what is the range of influences on the condition and health of whatever we care about.
Great, thank you, Ed. We've got 3 minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you if you've got any sort of final reflections. Sam, I'm going to ask you to go first. If you've got any final reflections or points you sort of think should be highlighted before we sign off.
Sure. Well, I mean, I find this. I mean, this is a relatively new subject to me, and I find that it's a really fascinating but really complex area of work. And I think there's a lot of advances in academia and a lot of technical and sophisticated approaches being developed. But I think this is outpacing the practical implementation of it in a planning perspective. And I think there needs to be quite a bit of consideration and investment into how you actually take that learning and understanding and implement it into the decision side of things, and whether that's increasing capacity and understanding within the government, or potentially developing, like, you know, teams outside of it, like consultancies that specialize just in CEAs that you are there to be reached out to carry out this work. You know, I think that bit is really key here to its implementation.
Thanks, Sam. Kim.
Yeah, it feels like we're still a little bit fragmented with it, and everyone knows we need to address this and what we need to do, but we're all kind of working on different aspects. I think just bringing it all together and having a strategic approach will really help. And then not just strategic, but those project level cumulative assessments do need that adaptive management. So we're learning as we're going, and we are improving mitigation and monitoring plans, and then that can feed back into the strategic overall assessment. So we need that feedback loop.
Brilliant, thanks, Kim. And last word to you, Ed.
Thanks. So I think that the really important parts, collaboration, interdisciplinarity, somehow bridging what's going on in the scientific community relative to the decision-making part. Those are all really key things. The thing I'd just end on, I think, is that we need to sort of like work on getting together a fairly bold narrative of an alternative. So using EIAs, repurposing EIAs, putting them into that something where they're sort of guided by a strategic process. It requires some alternative that can be presented to people that people can get behind, I think, to actually sort of lead to some sort of significant shift. There's a lot of data out there. How can we make the most of it?
Great, thank you, Ed. And with that, that brings us neatly to 1 o'clock. So we're going to sign off. Thank you all for coming. Our next policy masterclass is going to be on marine monitoring, and I think Hayley is going to be presenting that for us, Hayley Hinchin. on the 11th of June. So we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you all for attending today, and we will see you soon. Take care. Bye.
Thanks.